All right. It's wonderful so many of you can join us this evening. Thank you for taking your time to come and be here with us this evening. Welcome to UC UK Chats in association with Berkeley Club of London. This is a thought leadership talk series that taps into the networks for the University of California Alumni UK in the UK, in the EU, and also back in California in the University of California system. And this is one of the ways that UC Alumni UK builds community. My name is Jason Mullering. I am your host for this evening, and I am also the president of UC Alumni UK. Before I move on, I want to acknowledge the people that helped make this event possible this evening. So in particular, I want to thank Zara, who is with the UC Trust UK, Claire, who is our vice president, and Alexandra, who is the president of the Berkeley Club of London. And then also behind the scenes, M at the National Immigration Forum helped get this organized, and also Eva, who is with NNU Immigration. This is our third talk for UC UK Chats. Our first, what happened a couple of years ago, focused on global citizenship in the wake of Brexit. We had then, due to the pandemic, we didn't do much at all. But then earlier this year in February, we had a talk focused on racial equity with some fantastic professors from the UC system. And then obviously tonight we'll be talking about immigration, and I'll touch on that more in a minute. To get into the housekeeping, if you would like to rename yourself, so you might see it, the way that I've renamed myself, I have Jason and then UC Alumni UK. If you want to put your name, and if you belong or are affiliated with the UC campus, you can go to the right, top right of your particular thumbnail screen, click on that, and there's a rename function, so you can do that. Just to let you know, we are recording this tonight. You probably saw a message when you came in. So if for any reason there's anything that you don't want submitted, if you don't want your face in any of the videos, because this will probably go to YouTube at some point, just let us know and we can make those arrangements. If you have questions as the discussion goes on, then please go down to the chat facility at the bottom and put in your questions or comments, but questions are more valuable in this context. Also, while you are not speaking, you probably are on mute anyway, because I think that that's kind of the standard of how this happens. But if you could keep yourself on mute so that we can hear Nita and Ali and their conversation throughout the evening. So tonight we are focused on the topic of immigration. It is as an important topic now as it ever has been throughout history. You know, why might a person or a group of people leave where they're from to go to a new land, to go to a new place? When I think about the UC Alumni UK community, many of us are immigrants to the UK. This topic makes me think about my family. Probably most people it does. You know, I think about the 15-year-old young guy who left Westphalia, Germany, then Prussia, Herman Muellering, who made his way to the States and ultimately to Nebraska to establish our family, and other relatives who came from Norway and Wales and other places, oftentimes due to economic hardship and sometimes regional wars. Ali and I saw in Salinas, California, where we grew up, the produce industry and wealthy companies and laborers, the kind of tensions that happened there. So obviously Brexit is a big thrust of having this conversation, but we're going to hear from these two fantastic speakers who we're very grateful, thankful, and delighted to have. I'm going to have others introduce them in just a minute, but Nita has an affiliation. I think she has a lot of education, but one of the places she went to was UC Irvine. And then Ali went to UC Berkeley. And just to make it clear, Ali and I are longtime friends. We went to Salinas High School together. We have lived together in Berkeley and in Maui, Hawaii, of all places. And it's really an honor and a joy to have my friend, who is also one of the great experts on immigration, be here tonight. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for being here. We're going to have a great discussion. We'll have some Q&A, probably a little bit along the way, a lot at the end, and then you'll see me at the very end of all this. So I'm going to hand over to Claire, our vice president, and she's going to tell you about UC Alumni UK.
Thank you so much, Jason, and welcome everyone. So just to share a bit about UC Alumni UK for those of you who aren't as familiar with us. In the UK, we have an estimated alumni community within the University of California group of around 10,000 people. And we aim to connect and facilitate events and meetings and conversations with all of these people who are over here in London and share the experience of having attended a University of California school. So we host professional and educational, community-based and social events throughout the year. The UC chats that Jason talked about being one of the core themes that we will keep going. We're typically hosting for UK alumni, but as a result of this pandemic, we've been able to reach a much broader circle. And so it's very exciting to have this international chat where we have international speakers and guests here. Also throughout the year, we've got several programs that we do on a consistent basis. One of those is a mentorship program. This is for alumni. So we have alumni mentoring fellow alumni at huge ranges of career progression and lots of different aims and backgrounds. So that's quite exciting. We have a running club, which in normal times meets monthly for a running group. And now we have a running event, which is starting on the 29th of May. It's a virtual run, as everything is now, 29th of May to the 6th of June. Details are on the UC Alumni UK website to sign up, and then we'll celebrate with a social Zoom call on the 6th of June at 1:30 p.m. UK time. And then lastly, we have the annual gala, which is a black tie dinner and dancing event to raise money to support student scholarships back in UC EAP programs. It's a wonderful event, and it is a really great opportunity to combine our charitable efforts with a very, very fun social event. And we will be hosting the 5th annual gala at the end of this year. So details will come out shortly about that. And then of course the UC chats that we've mentioned, and we are very excited to have our next one currently. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Alexandra with the Berkeley Club of London to share more about our UC chat.
Thank you, Claire. Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Alexandra Broadman, and I'm representing the Berkeley Club of London tonight. I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to be able to introduce one of our special guests to you, Nita Nicole Upadhye. Nita is a London-based US immigration lawyer and law firm founder with 15 years of experience in US immigration law. She is the author and co-author of numerous law articles in prestigious industry journals and has been quoted by globally recognized news outlets, including the Financial Times and the BBC. She has held executive board positions with international bar associations and has been invited to speak on conference panels throughout North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And we are delighted to have her here tonight speaking at our UC chats. She has also held executive board position. Yes, we are delighted to have her here tonight. So Nita is the daughter of Indian immigrants who moved to North America to pursue IT and engineering jobs. She was born in Canada, raised in the United States, and now bases her practice here in the UK. Welcome, Nita, and thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really pleased to be moderating the discussion tonight. I think we will get started shortly. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored to be speaking with prestigious speaker tonight, Ali Noorani. We are settling in to the first year of the Biden administration after a tumultuous 4 years. Biden has set a vision for immigration that is fair, humane, and effective. He's dismantling the invisible wall around the legal immigration system and wants to send a welcoming message to the world. Biden's policies are forward-thinking and progressive, but the question really we want to address tonight is how much damage has been done by the Trump administration? And were Trump's xenophobic policies a deviation from or a reflection of the American values? How did his policies impact the UK and other countries? Did it embolden other countries to pursue white nationalist agendas? How do we achieve the progressive goals set out by the new government while recognizing the concerns of the anti-immigration and anti-immigrant movement? So that's sort of the intro to tonight's discussion, and really we're gonna hear these answers from Ali Noorani, who hopefully has all the answers for us tonight, and can talk about sort of what the landscape looks like in U.S. immigration. He's a preeminent scholar, researcher, and really one of the top minds in U.S. immigration. So happy to be here tonight with you. So we have a number of discussion points, and the first one I'd like to start out with is to talk about sort of the economic benefits of U.S. immigration. So we know that the U.S. is full of immigrant success stories, and America has reaped the benefits of immigration. We know that about 40% of Fortune 500 companies have been started by immigrants or the children of immigrants, and some of the world's highest achievers are immigrants to the US. And we know that immigration has fueled entrepreneurship and innovation, which has contributed to a shared economic growth. So the question I have for you is why is immigration still such a polarizing topic? And what is the debate defined by?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, Nita, thank you so much for leading this conversation. I'm really looking forward to this evening. And, everybody at UC, really so grateful for the opportunity to talk. And I'm really thankful for all the work that you put into pulling this event together. And, in the Q&A, if anybody has any questions about Jason during high school, please put them in the chat. Those are completely relevant and germane to this conversation. I think we all agree. So it's such an important first question because, I think we often have a tendency to kind of focus on the economics of immigration, and, all the stats that you laid out, Nita, are so incredibly important, whether you're talking about the US or even the UK, but even, the other end of the labor spectrum, right? So in the United States, well over 70% of those in the agricultural sector, particular farm workers, are undocumented. We see over disproportionate representation of immigrants, not just in agriculture, but also the service sector, as well as in healthcare. And I think that all became very clear to people over the course of this terrible global pandemic that has really, I think, highlighted for the American public the contributions of immigrants and immigration. But what stands in the way, I think, of solutions is really a deep-seated cultural debate that is really challenges what many people have thought American identity was. And I think that cultural debate, which kind of manifests itself as race, as ethnicity, as religion, as class, that is, I think, at its core, really the challenge that we face as we're trying to advance more progressive immigration policies is, how do you have a cultural debate in a nation of 313 million people that themselves are, can't agree on a whole lot these days?
Yeah, really agree with that. There's so many different facets and angles to the immigration question. And so, the topic of tonight is as perspectives on immigration in a post-Trump world. So it's impossible to talk about the current situation of immigration without talking about what's just happened over the last 4 years. So, I just wanted to run through some of the things that, some of the policies that he rolled out, and then talk about, whether the rhetoric was more damaging than the actual policies. And so we know that there were travel bans and extreme vetting directives. We know that there were policies slowing the admission of foreign workers and entrepreneurs to the US, the termination or curtailment of programs for compelling populations like asylum seekers. There were hurdles on naturalization of foreign-born soldiers in the US military. There were increased processing times for immigration applications. We've very much experienced that. And decreased focus on stakeholder input and customer service by government agencies. We experienced all of that over the last 4 years, and it takes a long time to get out of all that. So some take the position that his anti-immigration rhetoric, and we know some of that rhetoric, such as Mexicans are rapists, was even more damaging than the actual policies. Sometimes the policies can happen behind the scenes. Sometimes people in everyday life don't notice that. But when someone on TV says they think Mexicans are rapists, that's something that really is you can have a visceral reaction to that. So I just wanted to get your comments on, was the message a deviation from a reflection of American values? And yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
So I think it's actually bigger than what was happening in the US, say back in 2015 and 16. And I've actually spent a lot of time over the last few months really looking at the 2010s, if you will, of the world's immigration debate. And a quick version of that is, so in 2011 you start to see the Syrian crisis begin to emerge, and the precursor to that is the Arab Spring. 2013, the Syrian crisis becomes really a Syrian refugee crisis, and you begin to see massive numbers of Syrians leaving their nation. That all comes to fore, obviously, in Europe in 2015, where you have over 1 million folks trying to enter different parts of the EU, whether it's the eastern route, through the Balkans, across the Mediterranean, or even the west over parts of the Atlantic. All of that, the movement of people created a global migration narrative that was weaponized in a very, very methodical way, both by rhetoric, say by Viktor Orban from Hungary, Farage and the UKP in the UK. And that all began to kind of set a precursor for the way that people, whether they were in the UK, in other parts of the EU, or even the US, of how they perceived immigration. Mm-hmm. In 2017, Eric Kaufman, who was actually a researcher in the UK, he released this amazing book called White Shift. And one, I think, of the most, and it's just chock full of research, but one of the most important points that he makes is that it's people's perception of immigration is what actually influences their opinion on immigration more so than their direct experience. So they could have, they could love their local, Afghani restaurant. They could, love their local Mexican restaurant. They could enjoy going to church with immigrants and refugees. But what they were seeing on the television or on their phone was this massive movement of people that governments couldn't control. That's what Breitbart News and other kind of right-wing media outlets were pushing into homes around the world, much less the US. Trump saw this happening and he weaponized it in a way that, Orban, Farage, they were already down the path of doing. So over the course of the Trump administration, yes, it begins with that, summer of 2015 escalator speech where he says, claims that Mexico is sending rapists. Then December of 2015, he says that he was going to ensure that all Muslim immigration to the U.S. was stopped. So all of these things are piling up over and over again. And lo and behold, when Trump was elected, his mandate by the people who elected him was to stop immigration. There's been research done that polled voters in that transition between November 2016 and January 2017. It was pretty clear his voters wanted him to stop immigration.
Yeah.
And then it kind of starts on day one. So to get to kind of answer your question, it's like the rhetoric was just a precursor, and then once he was in office, was really able to put forward these policies that combined the rhetoric with actually really significant systemic changes that are going to take a long time to reverse.
Yeah, agreed. I was even thinking, as you were talking about Hungary and the UK, I just thought Le Pen came to mind too, in France, and so there are, I suppose, always these pockets of anti-immigration sentiments that somehow pop up every now and then, and it just seemed like this wave had come up all at once. And so I just have a follow-up question for you. So when we bring up this rhetoric and we hear this on television, is it that do people genuinely feel that, okay, we don't have the resources for bringing in these immigrants, or is it simply a matter of fear of other?
So I think it's a combination of factors. So the organization that I run, based in Washington, D.C., is the National Immigration Forum. We're a nonpartisan advocacy organization. Our mission is to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. Back in 2011, we decided that we were going to focus on conservative and moderate voters in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West. Let me jump ahead to 2018 to answer your question. In 2018, we organized over 24 what we called living room conversations. And we'd put together like rooms of about 10 to 15 conservative and moderate pastors, law enforcement, business owners, veterans, and asked them these questions around identity, around kind of how they were perceiving, how their communities were perceiving immigration. And what we learned is that folks had three questions or three fears when it came to immigration: culture, security, the economy. So the cultural question people would have is, are immigrants, are they integrating or are they isolating? Are they learning English and becoming American, or are they kind of staying amongst their own? From a security perspective, the question is often, are immigrants threats or protectors? Are they protecting American values, or physical or security threats? And then finally, from the economic perspective, the question is, are immigrants and refugees givers or takers, both from a jobs perspective and a services perspective? So, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we just say it's one question. I think all three of these questions kind of swirl around in people's minds, and we've got to think about ways that we're answering those questions, either directly or through other strategies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it comes, and from my view, it really comes from the government explaining and really honing in on what the values of the country are. I mean, if the values are, we don't want immigrants, and we think that the most highly valued, highly educated, wealthiest people should be in, or those of European descent, well, then it seems as though others will, the country will follow. But if we remember what our values were from the beginning, which is that we want to be a welcoming nation of immigrants, then that's what people will believe in. And it seems like we really have to have leaders who are open-minded and who follow that sentiment of being welcome, open country. It's just, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is it was startling to me how quickly the sentiment shifted once Trump came into power, and how quickly people felt it was okay to talk about being anti-immigrant and wanting people to leave the country.
Well, I think that a part of it felt quick, but it was really building in a pretty methodical way, because remember back in 2008, I mean, the global economy was really struggling, if not worse. Mm-hmm. So as nations came out of that recession, you saw the division between the wealthy and the not wealthy really increase, and the economic inequities increase. And I was talking to somebody in a small town in Iowa, and he put it really well. And he said, you can't fight that multinational company, right? Because they're nameless, they're faceless, they seem very far away, but they're changing everything. You don't have no control. But who can you kind of fight against? You can fight against that Latina because she can't fight back. So I think all of that economic inequity led to a racial and cultural anxiety that combined then to really allow for the weaponization of a migration narrative, which unleashed this set of policies in the US, the UK, and elsewhere.
So it seemed like it was always simmering, and
it was always simmering. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, so I'd love to just go on to kind of the next topic about, I wanted to find out more about the interviews that you conducted for your book, There Goes the Neighborhood. I wanted to find out what you learned about the hearts and minds of the people that you interviewed along the way, and sort of what were some of the takeaways. I think you touched upon it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. So, this was a book that was published back in, April 2017. So it was the first, few months of the Trump administration. But I really did the research and all the writing for it, I would say, over, spring of 2015. So at that point, you kind of saw how the country and the debate was changing. And, what my biggest takeaway from that is that the immigration debate in the US is not about politics or policy at all.
Yeah.
It's really about culture and values.
Right.
And how do we, who care about constructive approaches to immigration, really try to understand what's the cultural framework through which people have legitimate questions about immigration, and they're authentic questions, right? But if we don't understand the cultural or the values framework that they're operating within, then we can't answer those questions, and we're not seen as credible partners in this process to rebuild our nation's immigration system. So I think if there's any kind of like one piece there, I'd say it's about cultural and values. And then as an organization for us, what we do, kind of our informal motto as we are working with conservatives and moderates across the country is that we're going to meet people where they are, but we're just not going to leave them there. And that just takes a lot of work, and it takes a staff who is pretty comfortable in some at times fairly awkward conversations when people are just asking these really kind of difficult questions.
Do you feel like people want to change? They want to hear other points of view, even those who might have more narrow-minded viewpoints?
Oh, absolutely. And I think like so much of our debate right now in the States is kind of dominated by the far left and the far right. And I'm not saying they're morally equivalent. Let me just be really clear, but they do dominate so much of the debate. In our work, what we find is that when we're putting in front of somebody an opportunity to, in essence, kind of meet their aspirational goals for themselves, and kind of the person they want to be, they are then able to say, okay, I don't want to be the far left or the far right. I want to be someone who is comfortable talking to people, who's comfortable working with people who are not like me, who's comfortable kind of seeing how the nation continues to change. But it's all about, so much of this is about really putting forward a set of aspirational values, and that people can feel like, they can be their better selves. But they're not being kind of challenged or marginalized for kind of where they're starting and kind of whatever fears they're facing at that moment in time.
Yeah, right. Really interesting. Were there any sort of startling interviews? Anything you heard during your time traveling around the U.S. that was just very uncomfortable for you, or something that you just weren't expecting?
That's such a great question. Like every interview was always, you sit with somebody for an hour, and there would be like that 5 or 10 minutes. You're like, oh, that's the moment. Kind of going back through it. There was this church that I was visiting. It was a large Baptist church in, I think, Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was, small city in South Carolina, pretty conservative church. And I just remember a meeting with the woman who ran a lot of their kind of outreach ministry, or even kind of did a lot of their work overseas. And what she told me was that she would be working with refugee families, and they would resettle families kind of regardless of their religion, is that, you know, she would work with them, they would have a great experience. And she told me in this conversation that the one thing that kept coming up that just always surprised her was that refugee families in the US never felt like anybody invited them to their house. So people were always willing to come over and help and share a meal at the refugees' home, but that invitation was never reciprocated. And she just found that so meaningful and also so challenging. And I just remember kind of sitting in that church, kind of very, very surprised by that.
Here's a more personal question. I mean, I personally had feelings like this growing up as an Indian American. But when you were going to some of these locations, did you ever feel as though you were being judged by, you know, your ethnic background?
Yeah, I mean, probably, but you know, it's kind of like, well, what I signed up for. And I also really enjoy kind of being able to sit down with somebody and getting them to talk. And getting them, you know, getting the tension out of their shoulders in the conversation, and you know, kind of building that trust. You know, I kind of enjoy kind of surprising people that way, and you know, and then kind of, you know, I have I mean, you think Jason is a weird friend. I've got a weird set of friends in terms of kind of across the political spectrum. And
I mean, to your point that you made earlier about sometimes, you know, you can be just fine with, you know, one person that you meet in the street or in a social setting, or as a neighbor, but as a whole, the whole idea of immigrants coming and descending upon your town or community could be intimidating.
Yeah, and you know, I think the one thing about immigration is that, you know, the overwhelming majority of Americans have some sort of an immigration story, and they love to kind of look back on that with nostalgia. There's a woman, an incredible leader in the migration space, Doris Meiser, who works at the Migration Policy Institute. She ran Immigration and Naturalization Services for President Clinton. And she told me for the book, to paraphrase, Americans, they look back on immigration and they cherish it. But immigration today, they're very, very fearful or skeptical of. So there's this kind of disconnect. And, you know, how do we, through kind of, you know, what we're asking the media to say, what we're saying as an organization, help people kind of bridge those two things?
Oh, such an interesting concept. I mean, I think just along the lines with what you were saying earlier about givers and takers, maybe those who have immigrant stories from a long time ago think that they were more giving. They created what other people then later came to take, and maybe that's a concern. I wanted to talk to you about the role of police. So you talked about, you know, security, the feeling of being secure in your community, and wanted to talk to you about, or ask you about, what the appropriate role of the police force is. And, you know, because we know that some state and local police forces have agreements to enforce certain federal laws, immigration laws, and, you know, is that right? Is that fair? What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. So oftentimes in the US, this is the debate that focuses on kind of the role of local law enforcement and whether or not they should be enforcing immigration law is kind of boiled down and oversimplified, in my opinion, to whether or not a city is a sanctuary city or not. And that, I think, is it has not served us well. So my approach to that is that I don't want to live in a sanctuary city, full stop. I want to live in a safe city. And a safe city is where every cop in the corner can do the job, then kind of fulfill their oath to serve and protect everybody in their community, regardless of immigration status. And the only way to do that is that that officer is not enforcing immigration law. Because as soon as they're enforcing immigration law, the immigrant community is not going to report a crime. The reason why we think that is important is because, number one, there's no legal definition of what is a sanctuary city. Number two, there is a real public safety impact to local law enforcement taking on immigration authorities. But number three, by kind of taking this term sanctuary city off the table, because I can understand from the perspective of the immigrant community, the term sanctuary means safety.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly important. On the other hand, for somebody who has questions about immigration and questions about security, the term sanctuary projects kind of a feeling of lawlessness or a lack of control.
Right.
So let's talk about safety for the immigrant community. Let's talk about public safety for everybody. And you can do that in a way without kind of using a deeply politicized term like sanctuary.
Yeah, agree with you on that. What happened? What are some cities that declared themselves sanctuary cities? San Francisco, I think, was one. New York City declared themselves sanctuary city.
But you'd have cities kind of declaring themselves, but it was very much a political term.
Right.
The question really was whether or not their local law enforcement was enforcing immigration law.
Yeah.
That's the actual legal, that's the law, that's the legal decision that these mayors would have to make. The Chris Magnus, who was chief of Tucson, Arizona, which is near the U.S.-Mexico border, he's now been nominated to be Customs and Border Protection Commissioner under the Biden administration, which is, many people realize this, but it's the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. But Magnus, when he was chief of Tucson, was very forthright in saying, Tucson's not going to be a sanctuary city. But my officers are not going to be enforcing immigration law either. So he was very clear in terms of the public safety importance of providing security and safety to everybody, but just avoiding the politics of this term sanctuary.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, along those lines of kind of enforcing, local laws and encouraging safety within the community, what are your thoughts about the anti-Asian hate crimes that we've been hearing about all across the United States?
Well, you were talking earlier about rhetoric, right? And I think that, when Trump was talking about this as, I'm not even going to repeat the terms that he used, but, when you have the president of the United States scapegoating an entire community for a global pandemic, none of what we're seeing right now is terribly surprising. We did this event a few weeks ago with former President George Bush, and he was interviewed by the head of the public policy arm of Southern Baptists, and there was somebody from the American Enterprise Institute. And Bush was very kind of forthright in the conversation, very, very, very kind of straight up kind of saying it like it is, if you will. But there's this one moment where I don't even think the question was prompted, but he, this is what it was. He was talking about one of the immigrants that he painted. He just released a book where he painted, I think, 44 portraits of immigrants. And he was telling the story of painting a woman from, I think, Cambodia. And in the context of that story, he remarked on just the awfulness of the violence and the fear kind of being put upon the Asian American community. And it's not a very clear, it's a terrible thing that's happening. And I was just heartened that, President Bush just, he felt it was important enough for him to speak into.
I think we've got a question here. Maybe I can bring it up. Oops, now it's gone. Let me just check. See. Okay, interesting question here. So you mentioned Breitbart earlier. The question is, you mentioned Breitbart earlier. How might we address mis or disinformation at its source?
Well, this is hard because the disinformation networks, Breitbart, Fox News, OAN, Newsmax, et cetera, they're pretty powerful institutions. But so, you can't, if you have $10 of resources, trying to take on Fox News or Breitbart, it's not a good use of money. We've done some research over the last few years, and I've seen this come up in other research where, we asked the question, okay, what are your trusted sources of news? And yes, you have your Breitbart, Fox, et cetera, that is driving so much of this narrative. But then just underneath that, the second or third most trusted sources of news are family and friends. So what happens is that for a community or a subset of a community, there are created, very, very rigid in-groups. And those in-groups are defined by geography, race, ethnicity, religion, politics, but also, and those in-groups then are kind of the places where people kind of share information, right? They're the ones who are clicking and sharing that Breitbart News article. So what we found is that the point of engagement is really in that in-group, and creating a separate space so that, a conservative evangelical woman, for example, who is surrounded by family and friends who are saying, well, this is what Breitbart News said. But she's saying, you know what, there's something else going on here. I think that my cultural framework has taught me to think about immigration differently. So then how do we create a different space, a different in-group where she can ask those questions, where she can be a part of a community that is her cultural framework? Because, I often think, like, because of a misinformation, we try to kind of change the identity of somebody. In reality, it's really hard to change somebody's identity, but they can aspire to be a different person, even if they hold on to that identity as, Republican, as evangelical, as conservative. They can aspire, they often have aspirations to be treating other folks differently.
Yeah. We have an interesting question here. The question is, what can we do as individuals to change this weaponized narrative around immigration in our local communities and networks? And how would you suggest we approach these difficult conversations with friends and neighbors across the political spectrum, particularly given the prevalence of alternative facts? It's a great question.
Yeah, that's the tough part about all this, because this is not about facts, and it's really about somebody's perception of what they're seeing and what they believe are the facts. From our perspective, what we try to do is really identify the messengers that we think will resonate the deepest with a particular community. And that's why we work so much with, business leaders, faith, law enforcement, and more recently with national security leaders, because those are the folks that are going to be the trusted sources of information. And it's hard because, I often get this question of, okay, how do you do this at a very local level with friends and neighbors? And it really takes some time to be able to kind of take a step back, and instead of kind of entering these conversations as debates or as kind of a challenge to change somebody's mind, how do you take a step back in that conversation and better try to understand, okay, what's that fear coming from? Is it a cultural fear? Is it a security fear? Is it an economic fear? Or is it a combination of all three? And I think once we understand what those fears are, then we can kind of take a step back and you can start to create the spaces and the conversations that address the fears, but don't ignore them.
Right. So you advocate actually really trying to engage in the conversations as opposed to just avoiding them.
Yeah, I mean, my personal life, that doesn't apply, but yes, for work life, yes. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for that question. So let's move on to another question I've got here. In some of your talks in your book, you talk about finding a way to be a nation of laws as well as a nation of grace. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. And in fact, as I'm giving you that answer, I'll kind of pull in the question that Nick just asked about the U.S.-Mexico border and what's the Biden administration doing to alleviate that. So look, under the Trump administration, even before the pandemic, we were seeing a very methodical dismantling of the nation's immigration system, and really anything possible to either deport somebody who's undocumented, keep them from entering the country, or really trying to decrease the flow of legal immigration to the U.S. as much as possible. In fact, in 2019, we saw only 595,000 immigrants come to the U.S., and that's off of a high of nearly 1 million in 2015 and 16. So the Trump administration was on a trajectory to really bring immigration to the U.S. as close to zero as possible. So the question for us is, from a policy perspective, how do we maintain, how do we establish a balance between being a nation of laws that, for example, has a secure border, but also is a nation of grace that treats people at the border compassionately. So I think at the border, what we have to be doing is to create the systems so that if somebody is going to present, whether they're an individual, a family, or an unaccompanied child, if they're going to present at our border to ask for asylum, there's a system for them to go through that is safe, that is efficient, that is fair. That means that we need to have immigration judges and asylum officers at the border to process applications in as fast a way as possible. That people if they're going to be released, that they should be released with ankle bracelets so that they're still part of the system, but they're able to go to a community where they can hopefully get legal representation or more support. I think at the border also we need to, and this kind of extends beyond the border, is that we need to have better programs that have legal pathways to immigration, so that somebody can either apply for refugee status in Central America or apply for an agricultural visa from Central America. Right now those opportunities are so limited so that when they're faced with these very desperate situations in a place like Honduras, they're saying, well, I can walk to the border and I'm going to make a go of it. In reality, they're going to pay a cartel or a human smuggler a lot of money to try to be able to get to the border to present to ask for asylum. So I think to be a nation of laws and a nation of grace is to strike that balance. And at the border, I'm happy to get into this in more detail, Nick. That's a great opportunity for the Biden administration to really strike that balance and think of migration as something to be managed as opposed to something that just needs to be enforced and stopped. Because I think that that approach, which predated Trump, has it's failed, quite frankly.
And I think a lot of people, ask, what's the situation at the border in terms of children being separated from families, have children being reunited? Is that problem still happening at the border?
Sure. So, the Trump administration in 2018, well, in 2017, just so everybody's on the same page, they began to pilot test this child separation program. They started pilot testing in El Paso. And it was actually discovered by a criminal defender because what they were doing is that they were criminally charging migrants to apply for asylum, which then gave them, because they were in a criminal court, not in a civil court, civil immigration court, they had access to legal counsel. So I always think about if it wasn't for this criminal defense lawyer to kind of say, hey, what's going on here? That program could have gone on a long time without anybody realizing what was happening. So I thought that it was fortuitous in the most tragic way. So Trump over the course of 2017 and 18, separated, I want to say, with over 3,000, if not 5,000 families and children from their families. The majority of those children have been reunited. The Biden administration put into place a task force on family reunification that's led by an incredible woman, Michelle Brenet. And they've started to reunify families. We're starting to see more and more news reports of that. There's still about 1,000 children who have yet to be reunified. I was actually just talking to Michelle last week. And I think what happened through that family separation, zero tolerance policy by the Trump administration is that one policy captured America's current set of values when it came to immigration, and people did not like what they saw. So that's when we saw this massive pushback from the left, but also from the right, who said, you know what, this is not who we should be as a nation. And now the challenge for Biden is to say, okay, that will never happen again. But how do we create a migration system, immigration system that strikes the right balance?
Yeah. What are your thoughts? I'd be interested to know what you think about the COVID-related travel bans, and do you think that they are genuinely just related to the pandemic, or is there another motivation or ulterior motive?
I mean, look, it was pretty clear that under the Trump administration, Stephen Miller took advantage of the pandemic to put in place the majority of these bans, at the border or or in other countries. Now, from a public health perspective, before we truly understood what was happening with the pandemic and how the virus was transmitted, I could argue from a public health perspective, they were the right thing to do. But we now understand this virus. We now understand, and we've understood it, for nearly I would just say 6 to 10 months. Well, even during the Trump administration. So the pretext for these bans no longer applies. The political challenge for Biden is to how do you unwind these bans in a way that continues to build public support for immigration, and that's quite frankly I think is what they're struggling with, whether it's at the border or elsewhere. And I think what we're seeing with the Title 42 restrictions along the border, which was a public health title that in essence allowed the Trump administration to really in essence close the border. We're beginning to see the Biden administration slowly but surely unwind Title 42, which is good. And it's just hard. And I think as advocates, we've got to realize, we keep the pressure on, but I think we have to understand what the challenges are.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like we've got another question here. What have U.S. immigration figures been in recent years? Is the U.S. going to see more emigration in the future, and to where? Europe for healthcare benefits, for example. Interesting question.
That's a really great question, Nick. I don't know what the numbers for immigration from the U.S. Overall have been, but I do know that, for example, Canada has been competing for workers with the U.S. and increasingly. You've probably seen this in your practice, Nita, where Canada is putting forward entrepreneur visas, tech visas, all kinds of visa programs, really to kind of tell immigrants who may have said, okay, I want to come to the U.S. and they're kind of looking at the U.S. system saying, you know what, that's crazy. Let me go to Canada, where the system is much more welcoming and much more easier to navigate. So, I think and we've seen over the last 2 months more and more press attention to the fact that the U.S. over the course of the 2010s saw the lowest rate of population growth of about 7% since the 1930s. So, we released a paper earlier this year that we're advocating that the U.S. needs to increase annual immigration by about 37% in order to maintain the current ratio of working age adults to those of retirement age. And 37% is only about 370,000 if the average is about 1 million. So we've really got to be thinking about, what are the long-term social and economic needs of the nation? And we've got, I think there's just going to be a global competition for talent that is going to be pretty intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to comment on that, in my personal experience, in my practice, there's really, it is from my clients' perspective, it's the economic drivers, and if there are more incentives, if there are more incentives to move to Canada or Australia, then they will take those opportunities and also look at the social benefits and look at education for children and all of that in some ways could be more desirable in other places than in the U.S. But I think the question was a little bit about who's leaving the U.S. for other countries. I don't also have really those figures either. But the next question is, what comes first, change in rhetoric or policy?
Change in rhetoric. Look, in the U.S., Joe Biden won by 43,000 votes across a handful of electoral states. I don't think people remember how really, really close that the election in 2020 was. So I think we have to be cognizant that there are a large number of Americans out there who have been led to believe that immigrants and immigration are a threat to them, a cultural threat, a security threat, or an economic threat. And we're not going to change that understanding until we're having a very different conversation, whether it's at a national level, I think, or even more importantly, at a local level. So I'll give you an example here. The U.S. has committed to pulling out of Afghanistan by September of this year. Currently, there are about 18,000 Afghan nationals who worked alongside of the U.S. military who are trying to get out of the country through a special immigrant visa. Some estimates are that there are up to 70,000 Afghan nationals who worked with our military to help them, who would be eligible for humanitarian protections and to enter the United States. We see this as, number one, a moral responsibility of the United States to help these individuals. But number two, it is a great conversation to be having across the country, where you have veterans standing up saying to their more likely conservative family members, this person from Afghanistan helped me as an interpreter, helped me as X, Y, or Z. We have a moral responsibility as a country to provide them protection, because otherwise they will get killed. So I think there are ways to kind of have this conversation in a way that kind of resonates with somebody's conservative values, but also ultimately serves a policy objective. Did I freeze up a little bit there?
Oh, yeah, just a moment.
There we go, sorry.
Great, thank you. I think I have another question here. You've sort of touched upon this already a little bit, but you are publishing a second book here, and you'll have to let us know a little bit more about that. But you mentioned that it sort of examines what was going on in Europe in 2015 and how leaders then from there started to weaponize the migration debate for their benefit. And I'd like to know your thoughts about, do you think the Trump policies influenced other nations to be more restrictive in their immigration policies, or was it vice versa? I think you did touch upon this earlier.
I think it was initially vice versa, but now you've just got this cycle of immigration policies that I think are ultimately, that could fail in a pretty dramatic way. So, in the EU, you have really an externalization of borders, right? So there's this agreement with Turkey to try to push Turkey to do kind of that first kind of wall, if you will, for people who are coming from the Middle East or from Asia. You have the agreement between Italy and Libya to try to kind of keep migration out from Northern Africa. In the US, under the Trump administration, they tried to replicate that. They did replicate that with agreements with Mexico and Guatemala to send troops to their southern borders. The Biden administration is following some of those same strategies. So, until governments really see migration as a political and economic and a human phenomenon, and really manage migration in a way through legal pathways, through addressing root causes in sending countries, but also through a much more humane and reasonable approach to enforcement, we're going to kind of keep having this cycle.
Yeah, agreed. And so I'd love to know more about your feeling about Brexit. Do you believe that the fear of immigration influenced Brexit voters?
So when you look at the data, and the way that even that the Brexit campaign unfolded, I mean, absolutely. So as I was doing the research for this new project, you started, the Leavers, if you will, they initially made a case based on economic independence from the EU. And they realized that that wasn't resonating. So that's when you saw Farage and others starting to pivot to the idea of migration and immigrants being a threat to the UK. The thing is, and this was all happening in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. But the thing is that, the UK was far, far, far down the list of countries in terms of the numbers of Syrian refugees actually being resettled in Britain. So again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's kind of the perception of migration versus the reality. And people were kind of assuming that, number one, Syrian refugees there was going to be an influx. People saw what was happening in northern France. And then the entire conversation around, EU-based migration. And if a Syrian refugee was able to get to Germany, become an EU citizen in 5 to 7 years, then be able to get to the UK. And Farage and others were able to weaponize that to great success for them.
Yeah. Do you think that there will ever be a reverse of Brexit? In other words, that the UK will want to reunite with the EU at some point in the future?
That's a question way above my pay grade. I mean, I do know that, I saw some news clips that the Home Secretary was going to announce, their merit-based immigration proposal. And just from the news clips, I noticed that it was all very much focused on kind of high skill immigration. But the agricultural system within the UK, that's very much resourced by, staffed by a foreign-born workforce. So I kind of get the sense that the Johnson government is trying to say, okay, it's merit-based, but they're going to run into kind of longer-term, even shorter-term economic problems as a result.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a question from the audience, from Jason. Building on the question above, which is about rhetoric or policy, thinking about climate change and resource scarcity, there are expectations of mass migration. How do we deal with that? That's a big question.
Yeah. So the Biden administration has started to really think about how do they, number one, kind of put, make climate change policy part of kind of the government writ large, right? And how they're making all these decisions. But whether it's, the National Security Council, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, they're all starting to kind of think about, okay, what are the factors, say in Central America, and kind of an ongoing drought situation, which has pushed coffee farmers from the highlands of Honduras to, not to the cities of Honduras, because those are not providing any sort of economic opportunity, but really to migrate to the US. So really understanding what's happening in these nations because of climate change, what are the solutions that need to be put in place? And there's a push in the advocacy community, for formal recognition of climate refugees, and that will, I think it's a tall ask. I think that there's so many, people are moving for so many different reasons right now. I think if we try to fit all those reasons into a refugee framework, I worry about the repercussions or the precedent that will set. I think that there are other opportunities to set up legal pathways for immigration that preserve the refugee system for what it was originally designed.
What do you think should be Biden's sort of next big move in terms of policy?
That's a good question. So I think that, on the, in Congress, there's a lot of debate right now around protecting dreamers, in essence, young undocumented immigrants or recipients of DACA deferred action for child arrival. So there's one way to address approximately anywhere between about 1 million and 3 million dreamers through legislative fixes. Then there's separate legislation to address farm workers. And there are about 1 million farm worker families or farm workers, and probably an X number of their families who could be protected. So I think the Biden administration has an opportunity to really invest some political capital in reaching a bipartisan solution in Congress around those two populations. I think parallel to legislative changes, you've got a refugee system that needs to be rebuilt. You have, I'm sure, Nita, in your practice, lists of dozens of items that need to be fixed just through executive action. So I have a lot of friends who are working a lot of hours for the Biden administration right now.
Yeah, I mean, from my angle, there's certainly pent up demand for those who want to bring capital in and want to inject capital into the US, want to create jobs, stimulate the economy. They're waiting to get in. So we need pathways for them now too.
Yeah.
So thank you for that comment. I'd like to know then if you, do you have any concerns that any progress that might be made under the Biden administration could be reversed, if the political winds change? And I mean, I don't watch the news very much these days, but I had been hearing about maybe Trump making a comeback, for example, or a conservative government coming in after Biden's first 4 years. What are your thoughts about that? How do we kind of how do we cope with that? The idea of really going all in on changes that are progressive, but the concern that those could be for naught.
This is what I tell my progressive friends almost every day, is that in the immigration space, we've got to think about every single issue as a way to build a coalition of voters who care about immigrants and immigration. For example, that the issue around Afghan special immigrant visas, that is an issue that builds a coalition because it resonates. It has the potential to resonate with a broad swath of Americans. And I worry because in the immigration space, so much of the debate is dominated by the left that we're actually leaving aside a huge number of Americans who aspire to be better when it comes to immigration. A number of them voted for Joe Biden, a number of them voted for a more moderate Republican. So I just think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we ignore their fears, but also ignore their aspirations, because I think that they can be a part of the coalition of voters who are looking for a more constructive approach to immigration.
Who do you think are some of the political luminaries right now really advocating strongly for a fair immigration system?
So, on the Democratic side, you've got, Chairman Dick Durbin, Senator Durbin from Illinois, who's been a long-time champion. In California, the freshman senator there, Padilla, has been, he's now chair of the Immigration Subcommittee in the Senate Judiciary Committee, which has been great. On the Republican side, John Cornyn from Texas has always been good. Let's see if we can get him to vote the right, in favor of pieces. Senator Tillis from North Carolina. And on the House, a freshman Republican from South Florida, Salazar. She was a Telemundo representative or host for a long time on kind of Spanish language television. I met with her last week, and she's introduced legislation that would legalize, I think 10 million undocumented immigrants. So, there's quite a few, champions on the Democratic side. But again, in order to kind of pass legislation, we've got to continue to cultivate the champions on the Republican side.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so I think the message is that we do all have to come together and try to understand one another and try to understand each other's sides, points of view. I think, like you're saying, some more progressive people may not have ever wanted to reach across the aisle and understand another point of view, but it's necessary for real change, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Those are really sort of the topics that we wanted to cover, but I wanted to make sure that you kind of had time for any other comments that you wanted to make. We still have a little time. We have some time for questions as well. But if there are any topics that you sort of wanted to elaborate on, I think you talked a bit about the border and might have other comments about that. And then also, of course, there is still a little bit of time for some questions.
Yeah, so I guess I would just say along the border, the things to watch, particularly, I think we're going to continue to see high numbers of families and children at the border until things stabilize in Mexico and Central America. So the things to watch for are, how much time are children spending in customs and border protection facilities? But then, how long, let me put it this way. Right now, there's a backlog in the U.S. immigration court system of well over 1 million cases. What is the Biden administration doing to decrease that backlog? I mean, Nita, I'm sure your practice is always encountering that backlog. So you start to chip away at that backlog, and that really frees up the system. Would you agree?
Oh, completely. I mean, with the backlog for legal immigration applications are just, it's tremendous, and quite frustrating. The system is really still dysfunctional, and I think people unrealistically expected that when Biden was elected, that magically everything would be resolved, and we know that it's a far more complex sort of set of issues to deal with. On the humanitarian front, on the border front, on economic immigration, there's a lot there for Biden administration to cope with. But yes, those that we work with really are eager and ready and waiting to get in, and don't understand why there isn't sort of an easier pathway for them.
Yeah, I saw that there's Virginia has a question about aspirations do you think people have to be more tolerant? So actually, this might be a good place to close, because I always try to close on something like positive. So I'll give you a very kind of a real-time example. So under the Trump administration, you saw year after year, he would decrease the number of refugees allowed to resettle in the United States. And that number went all the way down to 15,000 in his final year in office. The expectation was that Biden would increase that number, and he made this commitment over the campaign, go from 15,000 to 125,000. Now, nobody believed that we could resettle 125,000 refugees in the US given where the system was. But still, we wanted to see an aspirational goal. In probably April, if not early April, I believe, President Biden said they were going to maintain the refugee resettlement ceiling at 15,000. So what happened, some of the work that we do is with conservative evangelical women. And it's a campaign called Women of Welcome. And it's really kind of engaging this community of over 100,000 women that we've built so far through their cultural framework. We started to launch a campaign where we would invite women to leave a voicemail for President Biden and urge him to increase the cap from 15,000 to 62,500. And the voicemails that were left were incredible. And women would speak to their faith, their, the work they'd done with refugees, why they voted for a Democrat for the first time ever in 2020 was because Joe Biden said that he cared about refugee resettlement. And these voicemails started to pour in over a weekend. And then Monday, or I think it was Monday, if not Tuesday of the following week, the Biden administration increased the cap to 62,500. And then something else happened is that women would call in and say thank you because they were just so deeply invested in this idea of being a part of a welcoming community. We actually released a podcast episode that talks about the campaign, and we included a number of these voicemails. So if you go to our website, immigrationforum.org, and track down our podcast, and maybe while we're wrapping it up here, I'll drop it into the text too. But it was a pretty remarkable. You just hear the voices and what people aspire to for themselves, their family, and also their country. And in closing, again, I really want to thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali Noorani. This was such a pleasure talking to you and hearing your views. I like that you like to leave things on a positive note, even though we're still going through some challenges. But certainly, I think what we're getting out of a sort of a dark period, and there's always going to continue to be challenges, but it's always good to be hopeful as well. And I want to thank the University of California for allowing me to moderate this evening's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nita, and thank you, Ali. I found that really inspirational and very enlightening. It was a lot of ground that you covered in a relatively short amount of time, so that was really helpful and fantastic. We had people, I think, dial in from Texas, and we also had someone dial in from Iraq. Actually, I don't know if anyone dials in anymore. They just press a button, but that's besides the point. And then kind of all points in between. So truly an international audience tonight. So we're delighted about that. Delighted that you all came along. For me, the real takeaways are that this shift from focusing on politics to focusing on culture, which Ali brings up in his book. If you don't have it, then I'm giving him a plug here. Go and get it. It's fantastic, and apparently there'll hopefully be another one out maybe next year, and check that out as well, which is great. And then also just focusing on our aspirational values, for just a constructive approach. And for me, this is really, I think, a conversation about compassion, regardless of where anyone is on the political spectrum. This is a conversation for everyone to be having, and for all of us to be, able to have it together and to be listening to each other and communicating effectively. So I believe Zara, I don't know if it's up or not. Yeah, okay, so just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what is coming up. For those of us in our community here in the UK, we have a virtual run coming up, the UC Running Club. And I suppose you could do that in the States, Ali, if you want to join the virtual run, you can do that. Every month we have an informal social called Triple T, which is the University of California's third Thirsty Thursday. And this coming month will be the first time in a very long time that we are going to be getting together in person, which will be new and exciting. And I think probably a lot of us are vaccinated by now, so very, very exciting. And let's see, on Tuesday, the 22nd of June, we have Navigating the Hiring Process as an Experienced Professional with the UC Alumni Career Network. So, and then you see the address at the bottom for other upcoming events. And then we also have all of your typical social media handles on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. And please do check out the National Immigration Forum and NNU Immigration at their Twitter handles there. Ali, I'm not sure if you put in the link to the podcast, but do check out all of that information as well. Nita and Ali, thank you so much for your time and for just leading us through a great conversation. It's been fantastic. And everyone here, please put your hands virtually or otherwise together and thank our speakers for tonight.